When we first moved into Oak Ridge Estates, it felt like we had finally arrived at the life we'd always dreamed of. Nestled in a quiet suburb lined with old oaks and pristine sidewalks, the neighborhood had that postcard-perfect charm you only ever seem to find in brochures. Lawns were always freshly cut, flower beds bloomed like curated museum exhibits, and every front porch looked like a still from a Hallmark movie. My wife and I had spent years working toward this, saving every extra dime, skipping vacations, holding off on luxuries, just to provide a better, safer environment for our son, Max. He was born with cystic fibrosis, a genetic condition that turned every breath into a small battle. Swimming helped him immensely, easing his lungs and giving him a taste of the freedom his body often denied him. Oak Ridge Estates had a well-maintained, heated community pool just 2 blocks from our house, an absolute godsend. We were ecstatic. Finally, Max could swim regularly, and we wouldn't have to drive for hours to find a facility that met his needs. We were hopeful, almost foolishly so, that this would be a fresh start. We didn't realize then that behind the glossy smiles and picture-perfect scenery, something sinister was festering. Her name was Karen Willoughby, and she introduced herself within minutes of our moving van pulling into the driveway. A clipboard in one hand and a forced smile plastered on her face, she strutted over like she owned the place, because in her mind, she practically did. Karen was the president of the Homeowners Association, a title she wielded like a badge of honor and a blunt weapon all at once. She was the type of person who spoke in rehearsed pleasantries, the sort that sounded friendly but never felt sincere. You know the type: oversized sunglasses, hair sprayed into a helmet of suburban perfection, and a voice that managed to be both shrill and smug. From the moment she opened her mouth, she made it clear that rules were rules, and that the HOA was the cornerstone of what made Oak Ridge Estates such a desirable community. At first, we humored her. We wanted to be good neighbors. But it didn't take long to realize that Karen didn't see herself as a neighbor. She saw herself as a warden. She ruled over the community with a terrifying blend of precision and pettiness, and to her, we were just the latest threat to her tightly controlled fiefdom. It started with something so small, so logical, that it never crossed our minds it could cause a problem. We had a simple wooden ramp installed at the front door to help Max navigate in and out of the house more safely. On bad days, when his breathing was labored, stairs could feel like mountains. The ramp wasn't big, and it wasn't unsightly, designed to blend in with the house's exterior. We even had it stained to match the porch. But Karen noticed. She always noticed. Within 24 hours of the ramp being installed, we received our first official violation notice. The ramp, she claimed, was an unauthorized exterior modification and needed to be removed immediately. I calmly explained Max's condition and cited the Americans with Disabilities Act, which protects modifications like ramps for accessibility. Karen waved it off like I was talking about conspiracy theories. "We have guidelines," she said, "and exceptions just open the door to chaos." That was the first time I felt that sinking feeling, that gnawing realization that this woman didn't just misunderstand our needs, she actively resented them. After the ramp incident, it was like a switch flipped. Suddenly, every week brought a new citation from the HOA, each more ridiculous than the last. Our trash cans, which we religiously put away within an hour of pickup, were apparently visible too long. The trim on our backyard fence, yes, the part no one could even see from the street, was 2 shades off from the approved color palette. Then came the most absurd complaint. We received a warning for having excessive medical equipment visible from the front window. What she was referring to was Max's nebulizer, which sat on a small table in our living room and occasionally could be seen from outside if the curtains were open. It was surreal. Here we were, trying to keep our son alive, and this woman was treating us like vandals defacing her kingdom. We started documenting everything: photos, letters, timestamps, because it was becoming clear that Karen's behavior wasn't just annoying, it was targeted. And I had a growing suspicion that she wasn't going to stop until we either left the neighborhood or broke under the pressure. Things came to a boiling point when we decided to install a backup generator. With Max's condition, a power outage wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a medical emergency. His nebulizer, oxygen concentrator, and other life-supporting devices couldn't be without power, not even for an hour. I researched thoroughly, found a model that was whisper-quiet and fully compliant with county noise ordinances, and had it professionally installed at the side of our house, discreetly tucked behind a privacy fence. But the ink on the installation paperwork was barely dry before Karen came knocking again, this time with a written complaint already in hand. "Generators aren't permitted under HOA landscaping aesthetics," she barked, as if quoting from a sacred text. I tried reasoning with her, explaining Max's needs, showing her the permits, the doctor's notes, even the HOA's own vague language that didn't explicitly forbid generators. But she wasn't there to understand. She was there to control. That night, as I looked at Max sleeping, his small chest rising and falling with the help of machines, I realized we weren't just dealing with an overzealous neighbor. We were facing someone who saw our child's medical needs as an inconvenience to her perfect little world. After the generator debacle, something in me snapped. I'm an engineer by trade. Details, systems, rules, that's my world. So I did what I do best. I got organized. I started pulling every bit of documentation I could find: city ordinances, HOA bylaws, ADA regulations, medical affidavits. I compiled a thick binder with labeled tabs, color-coded highlights, and annotated footnotes. If Karen wanted a fight by the book, then she was going to get a war fought with one. I presented everything to the HOA board at the next meeting, calmly but firmly walking them through each point. I made it clear that denying reasonable accommodations for a child with a chronic illness wasn't just heartless, it was illegal. There was a moment, during my presentation, when I saw a flicker of doubt cross the faces of a few board members. Karen sat stone-faced, her jaw tight and her eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. When I finished, the room was silent for a beat before the board president cleared his throat and said they would grant a medical exemption. I had won the battle, but I knew, deep down, Karen wasn't done with us. Not by a long shot. It happened while we were out of town for a long weekend, visiting family. We came home to find the generator gone. Not damaged. Not vandalized. Gone. At first, I thought it was a burglary. But there was no sign of forced entry, no chaos, nothing else missing. Just the generator. Suspicion immediately bloomed, cold and sharp in my gut. I checked the security footage, our system backed up to the cloud. And there she was, Karen, standing with her clipboard, pointing, directing a pair of uniformed maintenance workers as they unbolted and wheeled the generator away like they were carting off junk. She didn't look rushed or guilty. She looked smug, like she was finally cleaning up the mess she thought we had brought to her precious neighborhood. I could hardly believe it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was premeditated, calculated, and worst of all, it was targeted at a piece of medical equipment critical to our son's health. That's when I stopped treating this like a neighborly dispute. This was criminal. I called the police and handed them everything. The footage, the documentation, even printed stills of Karen's face mid-command like a general overseeing a battlefield. The responding officer recognized her immediately. Apparently, ours wasn't the first complaint against her, just the most serious. Because of the generator's value and its importance to Max's well-being, it was no longer just petty theft. It was grand larceny. I'll never forget the officer's expression when he confirmed that the generator had been installed specifically for medical purposes. "That bumps it up," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That's serious." They launched a formal investigation. Karen, of course, denied everything at first. Claimed she was merely enforcing HOA guidelines and that the generator had been removed for being unsightly. But the footage didn't lie. Her signature was on the work order. Her face was on the camera. And there was no authorization from the board. No complaint filed. Nothing that could even vaguely justify what she did. She had acted alone, and now the law was involved. The day Karen was arrested was eerily quiet. No drama. No flashing lights. Just a pair of plainclothes officers knocking on her door and leading her away while a few curious neighbors peeked out from behind curtains. She wore a beige suit and an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and outrage. She protested, of course, claimed it was a mistake, that she was only doing her job, that this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a family who didn't respect the rules. But the charges were crystal clear: grand larceny, obstruction of justice, and filing a false report. When they read her the list, her face finally cracked. That suburban superiority melted into something real: fear. And I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of justice. For all the nights she made us feel powerless, for all the stress she put on my wife and son, for the endless battle we were forced into just to protect our family, now she was finally answering for it. The police found the generator tucked away in a warehouse owned by Karen's brother-in-law across town. It had been stored under a tarp, unhooked but undamaged. She hadn't even gotten rid of it, just hid it. Like it was some piece of contraband, a symbol of rebellion she had confiscated in a power trip gone too far. When the officers returned it to us, they emphasized something I hadn't expected. They apologized. One of them looked me in the eye and said, "No family should have to fight this hard just to care for their kid." That stuck with me. Because that's what it had been all along. Not a war about ramps or generators or HOA guidelines, but about basic humanity. And Karen, in all her suburban tyranny, had forgotten what that meant. But the law hadn't. And this time, the law was on our side. The arrest sent shockwaves through Oak Ridge Estates. 4 years, Karen had ruled with impunity, dictating lawn heights, paint colors, even the type of holiday decorations allowed on porches. Most residents had complied to avoid conflict, grumbling behind closed doors but rarely pushing back. But her arrest changed everything. It shattered the illusion of her invincibility. The HOA called an emergency meeting, and for the first time since we'd moved in, the room was packed. People who had never dared raise their voices spoke out. Stories poured out like a dam had broken. One woman described being fined for her daughter's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. An elderly man told how Karen forced him to remove his bench swing because it disrupted neighborhood symmetry. Story after story emerged of intimidation, manipulation, and threats, always framed under the banner of maintaining standards. But now, people were angry, emboldened, and the tide had turned. Karen was no longer the guardian of the community. She was its tyrant exposed. By the end of that meeting, the air in the room had shifted completely. What had started as a review of recent events quickly escalated into a full-blown reckoning. A motion was raised to vote for Karen's immediate removal from the HOA board, and no one objected. In fact, the loudest voices were the ones most grateful for the chance to speak. It was unanimous. Her 8-year reign ended not with a slow erosion of power, but with a swift and resounding expulsion. People clapped. Some even cheered. I didn't. I just sat quietly, holding my wife's hand while Max doodled happily beside us, blissfully unaware of the battle that had been fought in his name. The weight of it all began to lift, like a storm passing after days of unrelenting thunder. We were still in our home. We were still standing. And now, for the first time in a long while, we felt welcome in our own neighborhood. But Karen didn't go quietly. In what could only be described as a public unraveling, she stood in the middle of the meeting, red-faced and trembling, and unleashed a torrent of blame. She pointed directly at me, saying I had orchestrated her downfall, that I had manipulated the board, that I had weaponized my son's illness for sympathy. The room went silent. No one came to her defense. She ranted about her reputation, her years of service, and how she had sacrificed everything to keep the community in order. Her voice cracked with fury and desperation, and for a moment I almost felt pity for her. Almost. But then I looked at my wife's strained face, at Max's small, vulnerable body, and I remembered every sleepless night, every meeting, every insult. Karen wasn't a victim. She was the architect of her own downfall. And the community had finally seen it for themselves, and the weeks that followed, the legal consequences caught up with Karen fast. The charges weren't just symbolic, they carried real weight. Grand larceny is a felony, and even if the generator had been returned undamaged, the act itself couldn't be undone. There were fines, court dates, and the slow grind of legal process, but what hit her hardest was the damage to her reputation. Word spread quickly. Her real estate business, which had relied heavily on trust and image, began to unravel. Clients pulled listings. Online reviews tanked. Agencies she had once partnered with quietly cut ties. She tried to pivot, to spin the story, but no one bought it. Not after the footage, the arrest, the backlash. Karen had always presented herself as the upholder of order, the gatekeeper of community values. But now she was just another headline, another cautionary tale. And for once, she couldn't control the narrative. Standing in our backyard weeks later, watching Max play in the sprinkler with the sound of the generator humming quietly in the background, I finally let myself breathe. Not just physically, but emotionally. The war was over. Karen was gone. And justice had been served, not just in court, but in spirit. The community had rallied. The system had worked. And our family, after so much struggle, had found peace in the very place we once feared we'd have to flee. I don't believe in karma exactly, but I do believe in cause and effect. Karen's downfall wasn't something I engineered. It was something she earned. Every action, every petty citation, every act of cruelty, she wrote her own ending. And when it came, it was as swift as it was deserved. For us, the dream of Oak Ridge Estates had nearly been shattered, but in the end, it was reclaimed. Not just for Max, but for every quiet voice that finally found the strength to speak.